I know you are all here to see our very special, not guest because he spends a lot of time here, and he really doesn't need an introduction because everyone knows who he is. But we're very fortunate to have him on our PHS board. He's our newsletter editor, and for the past 10 years he has served as our Perinton town historian. So please welcome Bill Poray.
Hello! How nice to see you all. Thank you so much for coming. I'm excited to do this. My day has been so busy. I've been looking forward to this as an opportunity to relax, believe it or not. Now, I have a little technology. We're filming tonight, which I'm excited about. And I also have this little headset. So watch this. I'm going to turn this on. It's a little Bluetooth speaker. You know, you can't beat the Fairport Library. Not only do they lend books. I went over the other day because I remember in the summer I saw a young librarian using this device like this out with a children's group out by the gazebo. And so she brought it out and showed it to me, and we tested it, and then she said, would you like to borrow it? So here I have it. And I used it. I wanted to do that because I have presentations 3 nights in a row. And I was worried about my voice running out. So we'll give it a try. You didn't bring your sunglasses. The only problem is my head is so small that it tends to fall off. So I'm not sure what to do about that. So thank you all for coming. I have put together some short stories. Uh-oh. That's never good. Where's my little clicker thing? Little slide changer. The elusive clicker. I've named this Historic Stories Never Before Told, and then the attorney in the family told me maybe you should put almost, because I've kind of told a couple of these here and there, but they're never the same because I make stuff up each night anyway. So they have changed a little bit. What is it, 2022? I've been doing presentations here for a long time. My first one was in 2012, and it looked like this. I was in 8th grade at the time, and this was one about Carl Peters that we did, and it seems like such a lifetime ago. And apparently when I look at myself, it really was a lifetime ago. So we have various stories I want to tell you about, and these stories that have come up, they're just little short items that have come up this year. One of the great things about local history is we can keep learning about it and finding things that, if they were ever known, have been forgotten. And technology helps us with that. I'm so fortunate to be able to be doing this when I am and utilizing technology that reaches into so many archives and databases, old newspapers, endless stories that come out of old newspapers, and leads for stories, and even websites and, you know, the Library of Congress, so many different places that information comes out that allows us to learn new stuff. I learn new things, and I'm excited to share them with you. So all of this stuff came up this year. First little one is the discovery of an abolitionist in our community that I sure didn't know we had. If any of you did, I'd be interested to know. His name was Seymour Treadwell. And this is an example of one of 65,000 index cards in the town of Perinton's records. Each one of these index cards is referenced to an actual old document. And back in 1940, in that time frame, the Youth Administration Organization, part of getting through the Depression and finding ways to employ people and teach them skills, one of the local activities that happened was the cataloging of 65,000 documents from 1813 to 1930 or so, and creating these index cards. So this was typed in 1940. And this particular one says Seymour B. Treadwell, the year 1823. Every single card, 65,000 of them, says HDF on it, which makes me wonder why they bothered. This indicates that it's the 18th document in 1823 that was cataloged. And it says May 22nd, license granted for keeping an inn or tavern. So we learn that Seymour Treadwell was granted a license. And this document is the evidence of that. And it goes into all these words about how Seymour B. Treadwell is of good moral character and sufficient abilities to run a tavern. I'm sure we have similar processes today. Signed by town leadership, and that set him off on his course of running a tavern. Now, the Treadwell family, they were pretty active in our community early on. I suspect this tavern was, if you know where About Mill Road is, off of Route 31, near the Canal Bridge, well, Benedict Road from Marsh Road used to come out at Route 31. Not until Route 490 was built did they cut Benedict Road off. And so that was an old country road. As an aside, if you ever go down Benedict Road, how many people know where Benedict Road is off of Marsh Road? If you drive down Benedict Road, you get about halfway down and you see, and it looks like a 1950 road until you see an 1850 house. And there's a few other old houses on there. So anyway, that's where the Treadwells were near that bridge of the canal where Benedict Road used to be. And he started this tavern. But that's not the end of his story, because that doesn't have much to do with being an abolitionist.
No.
But what does is what we're about to learn. Treadwell wrote a book. And he was urged to write a book after meeting with an organization that I had never heard of before, called the Perinton Anti-Slavery Society. Now, anti-slavery societies were a big deal back in the 1830s in big cities in America. Not so much in little farm communities like Perinton was at the time. And yet, he spoke to some of his townspeople at the Anti-Slavery Committee. And when he did that, he was so moved by their enthusiasm that he wrote a book. Wasn't that hard to find? It's been republished many times. Oh, by the way, these gentlemen, Abe Taylor and Chester Hull, are some examples of 19th century gentlemen and their families in our communities that were from slave families, that came here and made their lives here after escaping slavery in the South. Both of these gentlemen. And so it's not an abstract talk or thought when we're talking about the issue of slavery. It was within our community that people had escaped it. Now, you know, in the late 1820s, slavery was abolished in New York State. But of course, it was a raging issue long after that in the United States. Now, this was the title of the book that I have right here, American Liberties and American Slavery, Morally and Politically Illustrated. By illustrated, we mean the points that he made. There are no pictures in the book. However, the premise of his book was to take the 40 most prevalent arguments either against slavery or simply against even talking about slavery and debunk them. And this book has 40 chapters where in each case he takes those and he breaks those apart. I'll give you an example. One of them would be, there are good Christian people who own slaves. Therefore, slavery can't be bad. There are people in the North who treat their domestic help worse than some slaves are treated. Therefore, slavery can't be bad. So he broke those all down and broke those apart. This is the only photograph that I know of Mr. Treadwell. And it was after his speech to the Perinton Anti-Slavery Society where they urged him to write this book. They wrote, "On these premises, we lay before you the following proceedings. At a meeting of the Perinton Anti-Slavery Society, be it resolved, meet with Mr. Treadwell and solicit for publication these papers." They urged him to write this book. Who were they? Well, Two of the members, Anson Brooks and Justice Beardsley, these are fairly well-known names in our community. I already mentioned the name Benedict Road. Well, the Benedict family, and in this case, I.F. Benedict, was vice president and in the chair. So by having this book, we just learned three of the people that were very actively involved locally in this mission, this abolitionist mission. This is Pennsylvania Hall. It didn't look like this for long in Pittsburgh. And Mr. Treadwell makes note of it in his book, because as he was studying the first drafts of his book at the publisher, this building was burned to the ground. The day after it was used for the first time for an abolitionist group, 3,000 people were there the day before, and people against all this were so enraged they burned it down the next day. So he put a small item, did Mr. Treadwell, in his book. He titled it Mobocracy. While in New York, reading the proof sheets of this volume, I received additional and painful confirmation that my humble efforts for the struggling liberties of my country were not uncalled for. I allude to the burning of that splendid Temple of Liberty, the Pennsylvania Hall in Philadelphia, by a mob on the night of May 18th, 1838. This book is used still today in some universities for classwork. We didn't know that the author came from our community. We didn't even know he existed until recently. Now, I have told this story a little bit to kids in school. And so I'm pretty sure you know where Michigan is. But I thought I would go the extra mile and give them a map. Michigan, though, was founded in 1837. And I'm showing you Michigan because right after the book was published, Mr. Treadwell relocated to Michigan. He saw an opportunity, as so many people did, with the opening of a state and the land that was available and the opportunity that was available and all that westward migration. And so he went there. He wound up being the running the state land office. But in addition to that, immersed himself in Michigan's abolitionist movement. And as a result, just a few years ago, this enormous historic marker, it's this tall with a lot of words on it, says down near the bottom here, Seymour Treadwell, a leader in Michigan's anti-slavery movement, who wrote an 1838 book. So that's our guy. He has just emerged. I don't know that anyone had really heard of him before. Someone I hope we can be proud of, and it just inspires me that there is a lot more to learn, and there's more stories to be told, and there's more digging to be done. And that's our first story. Yes?
Mary DeLand on the insignia.
There is the name DeLand on this sign. William and Mary DeLand share a family memorial here. I looked for a connection to our DeLands. I wasn't able to find one. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But yeah, the small coincidences that pop up, right? Let's guess.
How did the name pop up? I mean, why did you first learn of him? What was it?
Oh, that's a good question. How did that pop up? Oh, I know how. I do searches on a million different things on the internet. And one of the places I go, in fact, where I bought that book, is on a website called abebooks.com. And on Abe Books, there are perhaps thousands of booksellers around the world who have their inventories on there, so you can search. So I search Fairport and Perinton occasionally, and that's how the book came up, and that's how I learned about him. And then when I dug in, it was easy once I had his name to find information about him, but you just need to kick the door open and get your first clue. It was fun. Also fun was another discovery, which I recently wrote about, but you'll learn a little bit more. If you saw it in the recent issue of the Historygram, which my mother-in-law used to mix up the title and turn it into a medical procedure. Still, the surprising discovery of a Revolutionary War soldier, and that soldier is a man by the name of Michael Wygant. And what we learned about him, and again, a gentleman that I'd never heard of, I was in the village hall one day with Tim Sliz, who's just ending his term as a village trustee. And you know, Tim was president of the school board for a while. He was on the school board for a long time before that. And a real piece of history right there, that we had someone who involved himself both in the school board and the village board at the same time. Quite a commitment. At any rate, we were in the village hall one day, and he wanted to research some things about Greenvale Cemetery, of which he is somewhat of an expert on. All these old ledger books with records of burials and where the plots are, and little drawings from 120 years ago of how the plots are laid out. It's wonderful, and it's daunting because there's hundreds and hundreds of pages. I, on the other hand, found this document. 100 of the oldest burials of Mount Pleasant Cemetery. And these pages, about 10 pages in all. And what struck me is most of them died long before Mount Pleasant Cemetery opened.
Struck by that, yeah.
So, and this is chronological. The first one on the list, 1837, is Michael Wygant. Then Samuel Lockwood, 1837. Lyndon Beardsley, 1838. We already ran into the Beardsley name because it was a Beardsley who was on the Anti-Slavery Society. By the way, we have a Beardsley Street right around the corner. So this was naturally an item of interest. Why are there dozens and dozens of burials in a cemetery that didn't open until decades later? It's not as nefarious as it might sound. This is a typed newspaper item. We're digging in digital worlds of newspapers constantly and finding things online. You know, our Fairport newspapers are on websites, Rochester newspapers. But this newspaper, the Union and Advertiser of Rochester, I don't know of digital copies of that. So we wouldn't have found this except that someone in the Historical Society, probably 75 years ago, typed this. Union and Advertiser, September 13th, 1865. A few of the enterprising men, I'm sure the women were busy too, of Fairport have been much interested for a few months past in grading and laying into lots a most lovely plot of ground a little south of the village for a new cemetery. The grounds were laid out by Mr. William Webster of Rochester, and under his care have been tastefully arranged. The grounds are on an elevation that overlooks the village and surrounding country, and even some parts of the city of Rochester are still seen from the summit. It's interesting that the word summit was used because the adjacent street is Summit Street, and this was written, about 8 years before Summit Street was created. Just an aside. This is the Civil War monument at Mount Pleasant Cemetery, which was installed in 1866. And as it says right here, Soldiers Monument, erected by the town of Perinton, 1866, and dedicated to the memory of its deceased soldiers, whose names are hereon inscribed, who so nobly responded to their country's call in its hour of peril and sacrificed their lives in their efforts to suppress treason and armed rebellion in the War of 1861. So, that's all about the Civil War. But we're going to go back quite a bit further. Here is a map of 1852 for the entire town of Perinton. And I just show you this to illustrate the rural community that we were. All these little words are family names, mostly on family farms. And in so many cases, it's not just a theory, but it's been proven in some cases that burials were made on family farms. Sometimes as a matter of convenience, sometimes as a matter of economy, but it happened. And so as we try to piece together our theory for why these dozens of burials occurred long before our cemetery was built, we think about that. Now, the oldest burials, and here's a shot of the DeLand section of our cemetery, Mount Pleasant Cemetery, from the 1877 History of Monroe County. That's where this was published. Here's Michael Wygant, born in 1763, died in 1837. Well, when I saw that name, I thought, Revolutionary War. We have to check and see if he was a Revolutionary War soldier, because he would have been of the appropriate age group. And then there were a few others of the Wygant family that were also in this group of the 100 oldest burials. Now, Mary Wygant was the youngest of those. She died in 1868. Now that triggers a thought. In so many of these examples, there were families in the 100 oldest burials. There would be a group of 2, 3, 4, 5 from one family. And in most cases, one of those died shortly after the cemetery opened. So it's not hard to imagine that when, in this case, Mary passed away, the Wygant family said, now wait a minute, maybe we should stop doing what we're doing. We have this beautiful new cemetery. Let's take these burials that we have from our beloved family and relocate them and buy some plots in the new cemetery. And it seems very likely that that's probably what occurred. This is a photograph from about 1940 of a part of the Wygant family, which, if you participated in the digital house tour that we had last year when we were still dealing with COVID, one of the homes was the Wygant family home, and it was known as the Deacon Harvey. His name really wasn't Deacon. He was a deacon in the Congregational Church, but he was known as Deacon Wygant. And it's always referred to as his home, and it was. But it turns out that his father was there with him. And here's a story from 1896 when Deacon Harvey Wygant passed away. And it talks about when he came to Fairport in the 1830s, in the early 1830s. And here's a shot of the front of the house. It's out on the corner of Route 31, just east of Egypt, at the corner of Aldrich Road, which is right here on our 1852 map, and there he is, H. Wygant. These maps are so useful, right? So, way off in Marlborough, Ulster County, we find the grave of the wife of Michael Wygant. She died in 1832. And we start to piece this together. Her son Harvey came here just a year later. And now he has a widowed father, Michael. So it seems very likely and logical, and sometimes we can't always prove this, but it's hard to imagine, for me, a more viable alternative, that after she died, the Wygant family moved on to Perinton. Why Perinton, I do not know, although it's a lovely place. And when they arrived here, eventually when the cemetery opened, they created a big Wygant stone. It says Wygant on the other side, and then there's stones like this, such as Michael Wygant's. Now the proof that he was in the Revolutionary War is right here. Here is his name in Revolutionary War documentation from the New York State Military Museum. Jansen's regiment and his name. I have some other documentation as well that this is our Michael Wygant, and we have discovered a Revolutionary War soldier that we didn't know we had. We have 8, 9, 10. None of them, of course, went off to war from Perinton, because Perinton didn't exist yet during the Revolutionary War. But in each case, they settled here with the Western migration. I'm going to fiddle with this for a moment. I think my head is shrinking. Maybe that's better. So that was pretty exciting for us to be able to find yet another Revolutionary War veteran. And I made sure I wrote about that before Veterans Day so that we could get that recognition out there and pay recognition to another person that deserves it. Got time for another story or two? Okay. This one's about an architect. And a well-known architect in the Rochester area, Andrew Jackson Warner. And up until this year, we would really have no reason to talk about Andrew Jackson Warner in Perinton. But we do. He created a long list of nationally recognized structures, National Register and New York State Register structures, primarily in the Rochester area. We know this through the Fountain of Wisdom Wikipedia. But it's a good resource for this. It's such a good resource because in each case you can click on each one of them and see photographs of them. You will notice that of this long list, none of them are in Fairport or Perinton. That's because they are not known until now. Now this is the Wilder Building and this is the Powers Building in Rochester, and these are two of his most prominent buildings in Rochester that he designed that are on the National Register of Historic Places. And you know, I love the Powers Building, and the story behind the Powers Building was when it was this tall, before this was added on, it was this tall. It was the tallest building in Rochester. And then another building got built, and they built it 1 story taller than the Powers Building. So then the Powers Building built this. And then another building came along, and it became the tall. Well, we'll build this. And does our flagpole count? So 2 great buildings in Rochester built by this, or designed by this architect, but also the Erie County and Buffalo City Hall, which is the beautiful building here, not to be confused with all this stuff behind it. Our lights on autopilot. Anyone recognize this? Yes, the seminary on Lake Avenue. Written in pencil, this is a postcard. Someone wrote on it, Lake Avenue, if you recognize this. A church out in Mumford, and maybe you recognize nearby, right on Whalen Road, the Whalen House. It must have been very hard for the Whalen family to find a street named with the same name to build their house. But so all by our architect that we're talking about right now, but then we find that there are some in our community. And the way this came about, the Landmark Society put together a book about 45 years ago on the works of Mr. Warner. And it did list, just in a few words, but no photographs, that he had designed some properties in Fairport. And so it would say, the Howard House, like 1881, that type of thing. It did give a little definition. It said the Methodist Church. So this one was easy to figure out. Now this is the Methodist Church in the same location where it is today on West Church Street, around the corner of Filkins and South Avenue. And here it is in a photo from about 1890 or so. This is Fairport's high school that was built in 1872, where the school district's administration building is today. But this was the Methodist Church. By the way, these are little houses on George Street. These are little outhouses on George Street. This is a small part of a huge picture with so much. We could spend a night on that picture. But so we have a view, and we know that Mr. Warner designed our Methodist church, our original church on that site. But what else did he do? You've passed this house a million times. 249 South Main Street, across from where Hulbert intersects, comes to a T at South Main Street. And this was built for Simeon P. Howard. Simeon P. Howard was a Civil War veteran, and he was known as Colonel Howard in the Grand Army of the Republic, kind of the retirement parading unit that took action for decades after the war. And wonderful house. It was built after another house was picked up and moved off of the site and across the street. If you attended this year's house tour, you may know that house, the beautiful little yellow house that is known as the Abner White House. So after the Abner White House was moved off of this site, or this was built alongside it and then it was moved, this was built, again, about 1881 or so. The only identification was the Howard House, 1881. So how do we figure it out? Well, we know which houses were the Howard houses. We go back through our research that we've already done, or new research in our newspapers, other documents, to figure out which house was built when. So that's definitely the case. 137 North Main Street, built in 1879. This was the home, and it still stands today. It is near the corner of Parse Avenue on the west side of North Main Street. And this photograph is from the 1908 home, what do we call it? Old Home Week. Yes, that was the forerunner to Canal Days. So what an event it was. And the house is still there. It's lost quite a bit of its detail, but it's still there fundamentally. And it was designed by Mr. Warner in 1879. Didn't know these were by this esteemed architect until recently. And this one. This was a shoe factory on Parse Avenue. The P. Cox Shoe Factory. And the newspaper story says December of 1884, and there's a part down at the bottom that says Wednesday afternoon. It was inspected and accepted by the architect, Mr. Warner of Rochester. That is the only reference that we have connecting architect Warner with this building. But that's enough for me. It's a pretty good clue. He had a son that was also a very prominent architect, but at this time, he was really just getting started, so I'm sure it was the father. And originally, the factory was quite small. This original part of the factory is still there today. And then it was added onto the following year, really more than doubled in size. And so this is the wing that was added the following year with the mansard roof. And I'm sure it's not a reflection on the architect that these huge boards are up here to hold the wall up. Not sure what's going on there, but what a great building, and how fortunate we are that we still have it. One of the tough things about being a local historian is you become aware of all the buildings and houses that no longer exist. And it's kind of depressing. But we have a lot of wonderful, wonderful structures, and I certainly feel it's kind of invigorating that this building has been brought back to life in so many ways, against all odds in some cases. Now here it is, when it was, the name on the top is the Sanitary Can Company. It started out as a shoe factory. After the shoe factory went back to Rochester, where they had come from initially, they came out to Fairport as much as anything, trying to get away from union labor and unionizing, and came to Fairport, where they were unionized within weeks after the factory being built. And that saga went on, and eventually they went back to Rochester, and the factory was used for a variety of things. For a while it was a sauerkraut storage facility, which must, I tell you what, I far prefer the smell of that beautiful Italian sauce in the neighborhood. Don't you? They built farm implements there for a few years, and eventually they settled on the canning factory, and initially the Sanitary Can, and then American Can. I'll bet you some of you had family that worked at American Can. Did any of you actually work at American Can? Big part of Fairport in our community. So that's that little story.
Cool. Related to the Warner Castle of downtown?
Pardon me?
Downtown and Highland Park, they have Warner Castle. Is that the same family?
Yes, yes. There's so many structures that the two, well, the son was the architect of George Eastman House. So some pretty important stuff. This story is a bit of a surprise. You may know where the home of Daniel and Minerva DeLand is. If you don't, I'll show you a picture of it in a moment. But it turns out, you know, you all start out in a starter home, right? And then you work your way up. So I'm going to show you the starter home of Daniel and Minerva DeLand. Now, the DeLand factory, the DeLand Chemical Company, as you know, kind of put Fairport on the map. In the mid-1850s, when they really started to prosper and they built their big factory along the canal where the box factory building is today, and that parking lot that goes all the way back to where BME Engineering is, that was all the DeLand factory. I'll show you an image of that. This historic marker, which is historic in itself since it was put up in 1949, says DeLand Chemical Company, site of the saleratus works, kind of a baking powder product among other things. Established 1852 by the DeLand family, the product which sold internationally helped develop Fairport, and that's all true. And here's one of an advertisement for one of their products. So this is the factory that stood early on, and we are aided in dating this photograph, which has been kind of touched up here and there. I think they kind of dramatize the signs on top. But D.B. DeLand and Company, that tells us that this image was created before Mr. Daniel B. DeLand lost his life, late in 1872. Did you hear how he died? Oh my gosh. The story that he fell down the elevator shaft at the factory. Imagine walking through the factory at night with a lantern in the dark factory and went down the elevator shaft and died, except it's not true. It has been said for longer than DeLand factory ever existed, but it's not true. We know this because we have found news reports as he was slowly dying in his bed in his home from a disease, from an illness. Far more glamorous, the story of the elevator shaft. I can almost see Tom Cruise playing him, can't you? At any rate, here's an image from the earlier 1900s of the DeLand house up at the corner of North Main Street and Whitney Road, kitty corner to the Baptist home, which, by the way, right here, we just stuck a historic marker in the ground a few weeks ago that we received from a grant from the Pomeroy Foundation. You've maybe seen quite a few of those Pomeroy Foundation markers that have come up lately. And this one is commemorating really the importance of the DeLand family to our community. And, you know, we have streets, DeLand Park A, DeLand Park B, we have Minerva DeLand School. We have Baptist home properties that are named after the DeLand family. They were a big deal and they should be recognized, but it was time to really point out that this is where the family lived. Getting those markers, boy, it's a lot of work, because you have to get your facts straight. Back in the old days, these signs, you just said, well, yeah, that seems about right. You sent it in and they sent you a marker. Now you actually have to prove everything. Ooh. Shocking. So,
Fake news.
this house up at that corner was not their first house, and here's how we know. Here is South Main Street in this map from 1858. Here's Pleasant Street, Parker Street. Everybody know where we are?
Yeah.
And look at this. Here's a dot with the owner of the property, D.B. DeLand. Now, 1858. When was the house that I just showed you built? We think it was built about 1856, give or take, in that range. So this map might represent where the DeLands had just moved from to go to their bigger house, with the prosperity that they were gaining with the sales of their products across the country and beyond. And you know, part of the success of that is the Erie Canal and the railroads. You want to be successful in that time frame? Having the transportation capabilities of the railroads and the canal. That's why if you look at our community versus a wonderful community in that time, like Penfield, it was virtually all agricultural, but they didn't have those assets. It stayed agricultural for decades and decades and decades after we had become really a manufacturing center in this community. Anyway, D.B. DeLand. Let's learn more about that spot. Do you recognize it? So where that dot is quite close to the corner. Oh, you sound sad about that, but Welcome to my world. So here we are. We have Howard Hanna, and you remember before that it was Nothnagel. Who can remember what was on that site? Now you have a kind of a Quonset hut building here.
There was a restaurant there, and then there was a...
Close.
They were across the street.
There was an auto dealer here. Does anyone remember a restaurant here?
Captain's Cove.
Captain's Cove. So layers and layers of history. And it's interesting, like when you grew up and where you were, you might find that the one that was the most important is the one that you remember. Anyway, here's a picture of this church motors being constructed in 1952. But that's not where the DeLands lived, is it? Here's a picture of a house that was on that site, and here's the proof of it. First of all, June 1st, 1888, C.J. DeLand, I'll tell you about him in a minute, C.J. DeLand has let the contract for the building of his new house on the corner of Main and Pleasant Streets to Benjamin Long, and work will be commenced upon it. Benjamin Long was a local builder. 1 week later, the reason it's 1 week later is because we had a weekly newspaper. 1 week later, Mr. Sadler has again come to our village and is moving the C.J. DeLand house, not this one because they just commenced building it, moving the C.J. DeLand house on the corner of Main and Pleasant Streets so as to make room for the new house, which Mr. Long is to build for Mr. DeLand. The old one has been sold to Snow and Parse. They were merchants partnered in a different store in the village. They sold it to those folks, and they are removing it to a lot on the west end of North Street. Anybody ever been on North Street? No. Sure you have. Rose Lawn Avenue. Oh. So many of our streets have changed name. You ever been on East Avenue? It was Sanford Street. East Avenue on the north side of the village. It was Sanford Street.
Pleasant Street was changed too.
What was it before?
Wasn't Cherry? I'm trying to remember.
Well, they did a big improvement project with sidewalks and trees, and before it was Unpleasant Street.
Oh,
But after the changes, they hired a marketing team, and they came up with Pleasant Street. I don't know what it was, but I didn't know that.
I think it's on the old map.
So, and then, a week later, Contractor Long has commenced the C.J. DeLand house on the corner, again, of Main and Pleasant, and is making very short work of it. So I want to pay close attention. Do you see the fire hydrant here?
Yeah.
Now, this picture is not from 1888. And the reason we know that is because Fairport's fireworks, water works program happened as a result of the burning of the DeLand factory in 1893. March of 1893. It was only then that Fairport said, we've got to get some fire hydrants and some pumps and be able to pump water around the village so we can actually fight a fire. We had firefighters, but we didn't have the tools to do it. So one of the things that was done was fire hydrants were installed. So there's a fire hydrant. Let's go back. 1952. There's the fire hydrant.
Oh.
By the way, you see this pipe railing?
Yeah.
It's still there.
Pipe railing, fire hydrant, in the same place since 1893.
Okay.
I tell kids in school all the time, there are little bits and pieces of history lying around waiting to be discovered. That fire hydrant has been there since 1893. Not the same one, probably replaced 15 times, but it's kind of fun, right?
Pipe.
So this house has this little diagonal cut on it here, this little feature. And these are Sanborn insurance maps. This map from 1885 shows a little house on the corner. That's the little house that was moved. This map shows a bigger house 7 years later, 1892, 4 years after the newspaper article saying it was built. See the little diagonal cut? There it is. So there we know we have the right house.
think that's the tree they cut down 100 years later or not?
Don't know.
It's right next to the hydrant.
It's fun to think about.
About 70 years.
I'll go back to
70
the other
years.
picture.
Yeah.
Let's see where the trunk is.
We need a,
It's hard to get.
wouldn't that be something?
Oh, man.
All right, I'm going to scan this at super high resolution and we'll count the rings. This is a portion of the 1885 bird's eye view of Fairport. And here's Pleasant Street, here's South Main. And so now we actually see the little old house in 3 dimensions on this image. How useful this 1885 bird's eye view is. If your property is on there, you can learn about your house. This, for instance, is a credit union across the street, right? Maybe you went there to a doctor long ago. This is, was Dr. Cry's house. Anybody here delivered by Dr. Cry? And what does that make you? Crybabies. Very good, very good. All right. This is C.J. DeLand. It was C.J. DeLand who was building that new house and had the other one sold. And he sold bakery goods and candy. He had a little store on West Avenue. And very close to West Avenue is where he moved this little house. And here, I suspect, is probably the route that it took to go to the west end of North Street, which is Roselawn Avenue. And that's the house. And it's still there today. And it makes all the sense in the world. If you go down there to that end of Roselawn Avenue, the houses are from the late 1800s, but even more so the early 1900s, 1910, 1920. This house is clearly a much, much older house, stuck into a row of houses that were built 50 to 70 years after it. So it works, doesn't it?
Now, have you told them that they're living in an old land?
I often do that. I often knock on doors and meet people or try to make that acquaintance. I've given it a shot, but have not been successful yet in this case.
Okay.
Wow.
That's the end of that story. Got time for 1 or 2 more?
Oh, yeah.
All right, good. All right, the Aldrich collection. The Aldrich collection. I love it when photographs drop in our lap. And that's what happened in this one. When we get images we've never seen before that help us tell more stories, understand our history, share more of our history with people. And in this case, all these little thumbnail views are from mostly glass plate negatives that showed up. Has anyone ever been to Pumpkin Hook? So Pumpkin Hook out in the north side of Farmington, right? When I first became historian, someone brought me a bunch of stuff and I was overwhelmed and yes, all of that and more. And there was a photo in there along with a whole bunch of bowling history from Fairport's bowling alley. And this photograph was in there in this great storefront. It says C.P. Grinnell, grocer. And I looked into it a little bit then, but I got back into it this year. And I learned more about C.P. Grinnell, and I found this store out in Pumpkin Hook area. It's not a store anymore. All of this beautiful area here has been changed quite a bit, but the building still stands, and it's used as a contractor's business, but also a home for the contractor and his fiance. And I drove out there with a copy of this picture because I wanted to share it with them because of what we just talked about, where it's good to be able to connect with the people that are in these places. And a guy was washing a boat out back, so I thought, great, somebody to talk to. Went back and I showed him the picture and we talked about it and he was excited and he said, I've got to get my fiance out here because she'll love this. She came down and she was excited and then she said, I'm from Fairport.
Oh, wow.
And my grandfather was chief of police, Chief Aldrich, Tom Aldrich. She never met him because she wasn't born yet, but she was pretty proud of that, as she should be. And then she said, I've got this little wooden trunk.
Oh, boy.
And it's full of old photos. Do you want to see it?
No.
Oh, okay. So back to Grinnell. The connection here is that the original images and bowling stuff that were brought to me was related to Ruth Grinnell, who is the adopted daughter of the Grinnells that ran the store. And it was her collection of things that was brought to me after she died years ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago by now. And if you're a fan of early bowling in Fairport's Fairview Lanes, I have things for you to see. At any rate, here she is, some of the pictures that were in that collection. But back to the Aldriches, and another name, the Slocums, because it turns out the granddaughter was connected to 2 important early Perinton names. Aldriches go so far back that the name Aldrich Road is named for the family. The Slocums have been here since the early 1800s and actually owned the property that was sold eventually to the Ellsworth family, where the Ellsworth farm is. Slocum still continued in the area, but that's how early they were. So these are the roots of this family. And here is the chief from a photo we have from our archives and some things I learned about him, so I could know more about the family and who I was working with. Here's the first example of one of the glass plate negatives. And this one is actually of poor quality, but it's one of my favorite photographs because we're looking at the Aldrich home, 67 East Church Street, the first home just past Greenvale Cemetery, right there. And there it is in probably about 1910 or so. And you can see the cemetery. And this is one of the family members with 2 horses on a muddy, dirty road where the priority was to pave the sidewalks with cement. Cement sidewalks. Why did we need those sidewalks as quickly as we could get them? The mud and the women's dresses that went right down to the ground. So our sidewalks were a priority. We had wood plank sidewalks across our muddy roads before the concrete, just so people could get across the streets. So there's just a sneak peek of one of the images. 1852 map, I used it in another story. We talked about Harvey Wygant. Well, who lived across the street? The Aldrich family. The Aldriches, if you can picture where we are, Aldrich Road, east of Egypt, the Aldrich family owned all the way from Aldrich Road to the county line. All the way out there. Two different households, and across the street. Meanwhile, Slocums were here, and then in this map it shows Ellsworth and Slocums, and up here, all populating along Turk Hill Road and Mosley Road. So very, very prevalent in our community. Here are 2 pictures from the collection. Came out pretty good, didn't they?
Yeah.
Let me tell you how I digitize glass plate negatives. They're 4 by 5 inches, the ones I'm dealing with, and I had experience with this from a previous collection that came in, and after trying to figure out every way under the sun to do them, using high quality photographic equipment, I used a very primitive technique, and I'm happy with it. Do you remember maybe your parents, maybe you, your parents or your grandparents had a light up, what do they call it, a little light board? Light box. With, a light box with an opaque piece of glass, lit from the bottom, and you put the glass plate negatives on there. And after testing different cameras, I found that a device in my pocket called an iPhone worked beautifully. And then through software, I can flip it from negative to positive and come out. I mean, I think the results are pretty good.
Yeah.
This is Mr. William P. Loud. You ever been on Loud Road in Egypt?
Yeah.
Well, there's a connection between the Louds and the Slocums and the Aldriches. And William P. Loud here is well into his 90s. I suspect this picture was taken in 1902 or 1905 or 1906. He died in 1918 at 99 years of age. This is his house on Loud Road. These are from the collection. That house still stands. It's changed some, but if you go down the street and look for these details around the porch, you'll still see that that is there. And the fundamental shape of the house remains. So William P. Loud. And where is he? Standing right out in the middle of the road on Route 31 where Mason Road and Loud Road all come together at stop 18 of the Rochester, Syracuse, and Eastern Trolley. You might recognize this because this is exactly like the Dockmaster station along the canal in Fairport. Those were dotting the way along the RS&E trail. Maybe you remember Nelson's store on that corner of Loud Road and 31. This is what it looks like before it was torn down, probably 10 years ago or so. But here's what it looked like, probably taken on the same day as the previous photograph. And even things we can learn here. First of all, you could get some Salata tea there or some gold medal flour. But this little box, vertically here, it says gasoline. That's a gas station. And here is a little house, a little Greek Revival house that we've never seen an image of before. Now we can get into our map and see who lived there and try to understand that more, but have never seen that. So the little secrets that these photographs provide us with, and more fun things to figure out. Let me tell you, you're all underdressed. Look at this outfit. Here we are on East Church Street. Now once again, 67 East Church Street. The Aldrich house is right here. Here's the cemetery. I don't know who she is, but looking good. The Slocums lived here. The Slocums had a house across the street. And there's the Aldrich house right there. And we talked about William P. Loud. And it is no coincidence that if you go to this corner of the cemetery, to the gravestone closest to the Aldrich house, is that of William P. Loud. No. Caroline Aldrich was Tom Aldrich's big sister. And here she is feeding chickens at a little barn building out back behind the house. You see some random stenciling on the building here. You know what that random stenciling is? That is from the car shops in East Rochester when they tore down the old wooden boxcars and rebuilt wooden boxcars on the chassis, and that wood was up for grabs for next to nothing or free. And all across our community there are examples of car shop lumber, and there you have it. Here's an interesting photograph. Back behind 67 East Church Street, those old maps show us those lots went all the way to the canal. This is the canal here. These are boats tied up, working boats, with planks so you could work your way up to the boats. Never seen a photograph like this before. There's a clue as to the date because this is the Parker Street Bridge. We're looking west along the canal. And the Parker Street Bridge, it has a curved arch to the top, just like it does today. Well, that bridge was built in 1912. So that tells us this photograph was taken in 1912 or later. Also, the horse blanket has a 3 on it. I mentioned when we were talking about the architect, 249 South Main Street, Simeon P. Howard lived in that house. Simeon P. Howard, in every photograph that we have of him on a horse, has a blanket with that 3 on it. Now that's not Simeon P. Howard because he would be a much older man by then, but for some reason there's a 3 on that blanket. That's all I'll say. Maybe we'll figure it out. This is probably Tom Aldrich's mother, and in the interior of the home, obviously, yes, I checked with the homeowner. We have several interior photos that were in this collection, and I shared them with the lady that lives in the house today, and she confirmed this is her house. This is her closed stairway, not an open stairway, and then this wall here leads to a parlor room here. It's the same place. So we were able to provide her with about 7 or 8 photos of the inside of her house that are over 100 years old. Again, a picture out back, and here's some of that stenciled boxcar lumber. But this picture is great. One of them is likely Tom Aldrich's mom. But in the background, it's winter, and the canal is right here, very close behind, actually. And the photography may be compressing that and making it look closer than it is. But look in the distance. There's a train going by. And it's not a trolley, because there's trolley tracks, too, going through there, closer to us here, but it's a train because the trolley cars, they traveled one car at a time. They didn't link together. So this is the train going by out back. We're looking to the north, across the canal, and then the railroad, and then way up here would be what we would call Macedon Center Road today.
High acre, Not yet.
Whew, how we doing?
Great, we're doing great.
We're winding down, don't have much to go. Oh, I got to tell you about ghosts. Anybody like ghosts? Well, you know, obviously there's ghosts because you can see them. Story is called Ghosts at the Can. And the can was the name for the can factory. And I visited the can factory after putting together an elaborate can factory presentation that needs to be done more. And I stopped at some of these places, Iron Smoke, Faircraft, all these taverns and distilleries, and I talked to young servers and bartenders, and they all said the same thing: tell me about the ghost. I couldn't believe, with unison in different places on different days, there must be a ghost here. Bartender at Iron Smoke said, I not only have seen evidence of the ghost, we have it on video. Now, I don't have the video yet. I wish I could show you. But he said, when the place closes up at night and we're shutting down, there's no more customers in it, crazy stuff happens. He said all of a sudden there was a crash and a TV that was securely on a shelf is on the floor.
Going there again.
No, this is intended to be good for business. Did I mention it's a friendly ghost? So at Faircraft, when I talked to a young server there, she said there has to be a ghost because I put something on a shelf, and she said my coworkers do the same thing. We put something on a shelf, and we walk away like a box, and look back, it's on the ground. And I pick it back up, and I walk away, and it's on the ground, or it's gone. So I had to find a ghost. Here's a photograph of the can factory from about 1960, just to give you some perspective. Here is a picture of a gentleman that I want you to meet. His name is William Purcell. He was born in 1858 and he died in 1918. Miraculously, we have two photographs of him. In this one, he is an employee in 1881 for the DeLand Company. And 7 years later, he's in the DeLand Hose Company band right there. You want to get a better look at him? Well, there you go. Same photos. Here he is. And 7 years later, he grew that mustache. Okay. William Purcell. Why am I telling you about William Purcell? He died in 1918, and he died in a tragic way at the can factory.
Oh, gee.
Engineer killed by bursting flywheel. William Purcell's head crushed by huge fragments. You know, those old newspapers, they just let it fly. And then this one, I'm mystified by their headline, Accident, a Mystery. Well, what's a mystery about it? Yeah. The flywheel burst. And then over here, more stories all about this. Purcell, suddenly, Friday afternoon, May 3rd, 1918, left a wife, sisters. Sad story. So we try to dig more into it. What is a flywheel, by the way? Well, William Purcell worked in the powerhouse of the factory, where the energy, the electricity was generated to run the factory. And this is an example of a flywheel, a really big one. Yeah. I picked the biggest one I could find. Here's a man, and this is a huge flywheel. But that's the idea. And in the story about his death, it said he had barely been in the room more than 2 minutes when the wheel exploded. One piece hitting him on the head and killing him instantly. Another piece weighing 800 pounds got launched on the other side of the railroad tracks. Other reports said pieces were blown to the north and wound up in people's gardens and backyards.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, here is from a Sanborn insurance map, a diagram of the can factory. And here is the powerhouse. Here's the oldest part of the factory that I showed you earlier, and then this is the part that they added a year later, and then it grew and grew and grew. But this powerhouse was part of the early structure of the can factory from 1915, so only 3 years before the incident. Here's a 1961 aerial photograph, and we can see that the powerhouse was still there in 1961. Parse Avenue is over here, that's the canal, so you all know where you are? Still there, 1961. Still there today. This building is the powerhouse. I know because I climbed around on rusty, broken down ladders against anyone's good sense or logic. One of them started to come down as I was coming down. But this is the powerhouse. So once I found it from the outside, that was the easy part. I had to find it from the inside.
Okay.
You've been in some of those places. They're beautiful and they're so nice. There's other parts of the factory that are an opportunity waiting to happen. They are dark and they are wet. And sometimes you imagine that there's things moving. But I found it, and this is the inside of the powerhouse. You know, it was a beacon of light, literally, because I had a flashlight walking through dark, pitch black areas, squishing in the water. And I was just about ready to quit. And then in the distance, there was a door open to this building, and I saw light coming through the door. I was hoping that was a good thing that I saw light. So I would like to think that that may provide an explanation that would at least make some servers and bartenders happy, and maybe they can spread the tale, and there are people that are enthusiasts of such things, so maybe business will grow. Ghost at the Can. Last story, a very short story. Very short story. But an odd one. Relics of a Mammoth. I didn't come up with that title, but it was published in newspapers. And it's all about something that happened in Fulham's Basin. You're familiar with Fulham's Basin? Fulham's Basin, and here's the historic marker from 1959. Early rival of Fairport, named after Elijah Fulham, a Penfield guy. From this settlement, Erie Canal passengers often took stage to Rochester. Okay, so get our bearings. Here we are on the bridge over the canal at Fulham's Basin. We're looking off towards Bushnell's Basin that way. That's the rowing club building. Here we are with Perinton Park over here. We all know where we are, right? It was here, somewhere around Fulham's Basin, in 1832, that something happened that had nothing really to do with oxen. However, I'm showing you these oxen for perspective. They're big animals, right? And if you were a farmer or lived out in Perinton in that time frame, probably the biggest animal you could imagine was an ox. Huge. Here's the newspaper stories from far and wide, and from far and wide I mean Vermont, and a faraway land known as Geneva, New York. And in these stories, Relics of a Mammoth is the title. We were yesterday shown 2 animal teeth of extraordinary size, which must have belonged to an animal whose species has for ages been extinct. They were found in the town of Perinton, near Fulham's Basin, a few days ago by Mr. William Mann, also a Penfield guy, who was engaged in digging up a stump. He was digging up a stump, he got 4 feet under the ground, and he found 2 teeth and part of a jawbone. Those teeth were 8 pounds each. Do you bowl? Do you ever bowl? I'll bet your bowling ball is 8 pounds. A kid's bowling ball is 8 pounds. Now imagine a tooth, 8 pounds. 2 of them. Pulled them out of the ground. Would you like to see them?
Yeah.
Oh, so would I. However, it was said by experts at the time, I don't have a name for you who those experts were, but it was published in these stories, that based on the size of the teeth and the sample of the jawbone, that this creature must have been 40 times larger than one of our largest oxen. So, in telling this story recently to 4th grade kids, who should know about such things, I explained to them that if this is an oxen, this thing must be at least 40 times bigger to qualify as the animal found, whose remains were found in Fulham's Basin. This animal is not likely to be the one that we're talking about, because this is a digital image I found from a creature in Australia. But I like the picture. I communicated this information about these teeth and this find from 1830s to the Rochester Museum and Science Center and spoke to the director directly. And she forwarded the story to her entire staff, and they were wowed by it. And I asked her, she said, "This is amazing." And she said, "Do you know exactly where this was found?" I said, "No. Wouldn't that be great? There'd be a team out there doing an excavation, right? But we don't know exactly where it was found." And I said to her, do you have the teeth? And she said, no. But I imagine that it's possible. Way back in those early days, there weren't museums and localities like this, but what there were occasionally were traveling road shows. You know, there was somebody that had a wagon that had Uncle Earl's two-headed chicken and, you know, a 5-yolked egg, and he probably added a couple of 8-pound teeth to the display. We don't know what happened to the teeth, but it's kind of fun to think about the crazy things that have happened in this community, including digging up those 8-pound teeth. And that is the last story I have for you tonight. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you.